Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. Look, I do my best not to run my mouth off. If you remember all the way back in episode 4 of this humble podcast, the episode about Cannibal Holocaust, we discussed the sad tale of one Robert Kerman. Not only was he the lead of Cannibal Holocaust as Professor Harold Monroe, but Mr. Kerman also had a long career under the name of Richard Bolla, or sometimes R. Bolla, where he was, in fact, a pornographic actor, having performed in 230 pornographic films. But in that long list of adult entertainment, there's one film that stands out above all the others. So much so that it became one of the fun facts of that episode. That fun fact was that Robert Kerman played Mr. Greenfield in the notorious adult cinema classic, Debbie Does Dallas. I promised you fine listeners right then and there that you were not to worry, for we would definitely be doing an episode on Debbie Does Dallas. Well, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, the day has come. This week, we will, in fact, be taking a look at maybe the best titled porno film of all time, Debbie Does Dallas, and all the sordid tales that came along with it. Just to get this out of the way, this week's trigger warning is that we will be talking about artistic depictions of rape. Now, dare I say it, but I do believe Debbie Does Dallas may be the most known title of any pornographical film. And admittedly, for a large number of folks, that's all they know, the title. And who could really blame them? Some titles are just classic. They feel so good to say that it almost doesn't matter what they're about. Debbie Does Dallas, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Psycho. If I'm being completely honest with you, friends, the first time I came across an old VHS copy of Debbie Does Dallas back when I was in high school, I was surprised that it was an actual film. I'd always heard of it here and there, but thought it was like the 555 of adult films. You know, something you said because you couldn't give out the real thing. Fun fact, the film's original title was Teenage Services. It was actually mafia porn czar Mickey Zaffarano that gave the film its name. At first, the producer said that it didn't make any sense grammatically, to which Zaffarano countered, "Yeah, that's why people are going to like it." But having watched the film now a number of times over the years, I don't believe this is solely a case of a good title. Much like the aforementioned Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Psycho, the title may lure you in, but it's what's on the inside that counts. For the record, Debbie Does Dallas does not take place in Dallas. Our protagonist, our hero, if you will, Debbie Benton, is a cheerleader at a local high school, probably in New York State somewhere. She has recently won the opportunity of a lifetime. After winning a cheerleading competition, she has been invited to try out for the world-famous Texas Cowgirls. In obvious reference to the Dallas Cowgirls, which, fun fact, is the official end of my knowledge of football. Dear listeners, things were looking up in the world of Debbie Benton, but alas, as our picture begins, she comes bearing terrible news to the rest of her squad. As it turns out, Debbie's parents are none too fond of the idea and have steadfastly refused to pay for her transport and lodging to Texas, leaving Debbie unable to live out her dreams. But that would make for quite a short movie with a very unsatisfactory ending. So, Debbie's cheer squad rallies around her. Cheerleaders are in fact known for their rallying capabilities, and decided that they would all get jobs and raise money, not only so Debbie herself can go out to the tryouts in Texas, but so that they can all go for moral support. The company they form, they name the aforementioned Teen Services. They all go out and get jobs around town, anything from the library, washing a neighbor's car, helping out local candle makers, Mr. and Mrs. Hardwick. See what they did there? And Debbie herself lands a gig at the local sporting goods store, run by none other than Mr. Greenfield, played by the incomparable and aforementioned R. Bola, a.k.a. Richard Bola, a.k.a. Robert Kerman. He is the first to get the idea to see what services Teen Services really has to offer. Now, it is here that it should be noted, my dearest listener, friends, if I may be so bold, I should bring up the fact that what is about to unfold through the rest of the film is fantasy depictions of adults having sex with children. True, they are close to 18, but we all know that close in this case is not close enough. You folks are smart and don't need to hear me say this. But for the folks in the back and those who don't know where my heart is, this is a work of artistic fantasy. Everyone involved was over 18. And in real life, statutory rape is still rape, and rape is wrong. Always. So back to the story. This is where Mr. Greenfield blurts out, quote, "I'll give you $10 to show me your tits," end quote. Debbie protests at first, but eventually takes the money. He offers more money to get more handsy, which she accepts. But eventually, he offers even more to go even further, and she pulls her shirt down and says if he doesn't stop, she's going to call her mother. At which point, he immediately stops. Later, whilst in the locker room, because of course, Debbie shares with her fellow teen service teens the story of how she made a little extra money. She assures them that there were things they could do and still be quote unquote good girls. And by that, of course, she means without having penile vaginal penetration. Spoiler alert, that doesn't happen. This is indeed a porno film, so lots of sex and sexual encounters ensue. But the big twist, they still didn't have enough until Mr. Greenfield steps in. He says if Debbie dresses up in the Texas cowgirl uniform and comes back to the shop for a surprise, he will pay not only for her, but her whole squad to go out to Dallas, which she does, only to find that Mr. Greenfield has put on a football costume, or I guess football uniform. He tells Debbie that he was always too small to be on the football team. There was one area where he was bigger than all the other guys. It was his penis. He explained that he had dreamed of being the captain of the football team and fucking the head cheerleader, which, not to ruin the ending, he does. As he finishes, the film cuts to a bad graphic of what I can only assume was a football field with the words "Touchdown, Mr. Greenfield," and then a blue screen with the words "Score 1 for Debbie." Also, just for the record, I will throw out there that the score to this film is surprisingly lush and layered. I had a film studies teacher tell me once while we were studying Casablanca that things in it may seem cliche, but the only reason they're cliche was because Casablanca did them so well in the first place. And I think that's the enduring love behind Debbie Does Dallas. The score, the story, the acting, even down to the body types and the body hair of its performers, and even its very title. It's all so very cliche, but it is every cliche that we associate with that glorious era of porn. The stuff that if you never watched a single porno flick in your life, you would recognize every last one of these cliches just from popular culture at large. This is probably why Debbie Does Dallas has been sequelized and remade and parodied more than any other adult film in history. Now, let me be clear. Am I saying Debbie Does Dallas is the Casablanca of porno? No, of course not. That would be dumb. Am I denying that Debbie Does Dallas is the Casablanca of porno? You know, another thing that helped the popularity of Debbie Does Dallas is that it was one of the first adult films to be released on the brand new VHS format, tell you that much. And although that may have helped cement Debbie as a classic, it also exposed a fatal error made by School Day, the company behind Debbie Does Dallas, which was essentially just Jim Buckley, the man who produced and directed Debbie Does Dallas under the name Jim Clark. See, when the film first screened in New York's Pussycat Theater in 1979, it did so without a copyright notice. Now, this is not the first time something like this has happened. Fun fact, George A. Romero's infamous, notorious, genre-defining watershed classic, Night of the Living Dead, has been public domain, well, pretty much since it was first released, which you would know already if you followed my TikTok at BandRonnie. But the fact that Debbie Does Dallas wasn't copyrighted has thrown the film into this sort of long, murky, legal gray area that along the way has somehow managed to pull other porn chic classics into its waters. And all of that's still going on today. Now, I hear you clamoring through your various Bluetooth connected devices that wouldn't have been obscenity laws that in fact brought the film down, not copyright. And friends, you're not entirely wrong. It was included in the 1983 New York court case, the United States versus various articles of obscene merchandise. But even in that court case, whose name, by the way, rivals Debbie Does Dallas in all-time great titles, it was determined that the film was not obscene. Keep in mind that this film was released in 1978, towards the end of what we know as the golden era of porn. There was definitely a time in America where full-out porno films were mostly on the wrong side of the law, but while not entirely responsible for the newfound X-rated freedoms, the film Deep Throat had done a lot of the heavy lifting 6 years ago in 1972, taking the legal brunt and paving the way for further adult content. But, as they say in the never-ending story, that is another story. Now, it should be noted that there was one legal hurdle to jump that created more problems than the obscenity rap, but less than the copyright issue. And this Goldilocks of a legal conundrum was a trademark violation. Now, the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders, more popularly known as the Dallas Cowgirls, were none too fond of this movie, surprising absolutely no one. And while the film itself was careful to only refer to the professional cheerleading squad as the Texas Cowgirls, and the only time Dallas is mentioned is in the title with no reference to a football team, the Dallas Cowgirls went after the advertising, claiming that their trademark uniforms were mimicked in the advertising of Debbie Does Dallas. Unfortunately, the court agreed with them. It's a decision that has been rightfully criticized on free speech grounds, but at the end of the day, the court decided that it could mislead consumers as to whether or not the Dallas Cowgirls sponsored or approved of the film, which in court documents they referred to as a dirty sex film. Fortunately, though, this case was only brought against the Pussycat Theater, so while it was forced to stop playing the film, other theaters and future home video copies would not be affected by the ruling. Now, that brings us to the final boss, the copyright issue. And this legal drama was heavy on the drama, dear listeners. The story gets a little convoluted, so I'll try my best to keep it as simple as I can. First off, like we stated before, the film premiered for the first time in October of 1978 and failed to have a copyright notice on it. At this point, the film was still owned by School Day, a company whose only officer was Jim Buckley, who had produced and directed the film. 2 months later, in December of 78, still no one had noticed that the film was lacking a copyright, and Jim Buckley, as School Day, sells the film and all of its rights to a company called M&A Associates, who is the new rights holder of the film, and now you can forget about Buckley and School Day. They don't pop their heads into this story again. About 2 months later, in February of 1979, M&A Associates strikes a deal with a company named VCX for VCX to distribute the film on the brand new format VHS. At this point in time, everybody is still blissfully unaware that the actual celluloid film version of the movie is still without any form of copyright. 2 months later, in April of 79, for those of you keeping track, VCX becomes aware of what at the time was referred to as dupers. These are folks that would buy a copy of the VHS tape and make illegal copies and sell them as their own. This is a clear violation of copyright, so VCX started to send their lawyers after these dupers. But here's the thing. It's only a violation of copyright if the thing is copyrighted. That's kind of copyright 101. VCX had been smart enough to put a copyright on all their VHS copies of the film, but as long as the actual celluloid film version of the film was still being passed around without copyright, it meant nothing because the dupers were free to make VHS copies or any other format really of the original uncopyrighted work. There was hope though. None of this had been set in stone yet. All VCX had to do to make sure they could retain their exclusive copyright was make sure that all the copies of the celluloid film had the copyright symbol on them. Now, this may seem like a daunting task at first, but keep in mind this was an end game. As much as porn chic was still in full bloom, it was an adult movie with a handful of copies that were stored at a warehouse and sent out to theaters for short runs only when requested. All they had to do was bring those copies back to Cinefex Color Lab, where they originally had the copies made, and Cinefex could pop on a copyright symbol, and then Debbie Does Dallas, in all of its different formats, would be fully protected under U.S. copyright laws. There was one problem, though. VCX had no access to the original celluloid film copies. And beyond that, even if they did, they had no rights to do anything with them. The original celluloid copies and all the rights therein were still held by M&A Associates, the head honcho of which was a man named Arthur Weisberg, the only one with the power to get this film copyrighted. VCX brought the dilemma to the attention of Weisberg and requested that he get the film copies copyrighted. Weisberg refused. Even after the lawyers explained it to him, he still refused. Why, you might ask? Sadly, I have no fucking clue what the plan was there. It became the opinion of the lawyers involved that this action, or more precisely inaction, had gone on long enough that any attempt to keep the film out of public domain would be futile. So, in 1982, only 2 short years after VCX was brought on board to distribute Debbie Does Dallas, they terminated their contract with M&A Associates and continued to distribute the film on VHS without paying any royalties to M&A because the film was now in the public domain and they didn't need to. Well, that got Mr. Weisberg giving a shit about copyright in a hurry. 5 years later, in 1987, okay, maybe not that much of a hurry, M&A Associates would bring suit against VCX for breach of contract. They made the argument that when they sold VCX the exclusive rights to Debbie Does Dallas, that exclusive in this case meant they would not sell them to anyone else, not that nobody else would have them. To which the judge replied, quote, "Hey, dipshit, that's fucking dumb. You are fucking dumb, and this whole mess could have been avoided if you just got the copyright. Please leave my courtroom and promptly return to idiot land." End quote. Okay, fine, I might have paraphrased that one a little. But the court did find in favor of VCX, stating that, and this one is an actual quote, "Weisberg's actions had thrust the film irretrievably into the United States public domain." End quote. So The trade for VCX was they no longer had to pay M&A Associates royalties, but were legally defenseless when going after those dastardly dupers. And so VCX held on to its murky clutch of the rights of Debbie Does Dallas, and that understanding continues into the next century. Enter Arrow. Arrow is another adult film distributor, and it has picked up on the fact that VCX's claim to the rights of Debbie Does Dallas is not only shaky at best, but sees that that's true of yet another title in the VCX library, The Devil and Miss Jones, which, in all honesty, may be my favorite adult film of all time, and I highly recommend. So Arrow started what would turn into a very strange game of chicken. VCX was obviously upset, but what could they do? The truth was their rights to Debbie Does Dallas were shaky at best and most likely non-existent. If they took Arrow to court, it would only shine a light on that fact and make the film fall even further into the public domain. So they did the only thing they felt they could do. You see, Arrow wasn't without its library of classic erotic films, not the least of which was being the aforementioned and groundbreaking Deep Throat. Deep Throat had a similar problem with its copyright, also stemming from the fact that it too lacked the copyright symbol when it originally premiered. So, in retaliation, VCX began to distribute Deep Throat. Then, in 2009, Arrow broke the Cold War and sued VCX for copyright infringement on Deep Throat. If this case were to go all the way, it could very well throw the copyrights of all three films into the public domain. But as it turns out, there was a small technicality about the way they released Deep Throat, which we will discuss more in depth when Deep Throat gets its own episode. But that gave Arrow a slightly bigger claim to its copyright over Deep Throat. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and then on October 18th, 2011, the two companies came to an agreement. They would agree that Arrow was indeed the copyright holder of Deep Throat, and in return, Arrow agreed to permanently stop selling copies of Debbie Does Dallas, leaving to this day the fates of the rights of three giants of the golden era of porn not more than one lawsuit away from possibly being changed forever. Now, this is all well and good. A history of the film and its legal woes on its ascent to infamy. But what of the people? Our good friends in the adult industry that made this film possible. I can tell you, my friends, it is a tale shrouded in mystery and, other stuff. And I will tell you, just not this episode. So tune in, same bat time, same bat channel, next episode for Debbie Does Dallas Part 2. Well, Part 2 of our look at Debbie Does Dallas, not the film Debbie Does Dallas 2. And, fun fact, I will continue to say the full name of the film, Debbie Does Dallas, every time I say it in that episode too. Final fun fact, I'll miss you, friends. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time on the Band Media Podcast. Oh, there goes that music again. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Band Media Podcast. Email us at bandmediapodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Ronnie Ursenbach. And please like, comment, subscribe. And if you donate blood, come join our Band Media Podcast team on the Red Cross app. And if you don't donate blood, then think about starting and then do the thing I just said. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.